My mom, Emily, is a blonde with blue eyes. She is smart, well-mannered, and beautiful, but she has a difficult temperament. My father left when my brother was only a year old, and that's where my story begins. It was January, the middle of winter, and we were supposed to be visiting relatives in a small town. I was 20 years old and my mom was 42 years old. My little brother, Jack, is only 1 year old. My mom had her driver's license and an older Chevy, and we hit the road early in the morning, hoping to make it before the weather worsened. The air was cold and the sky was a dreary gray, threatening snow. We wrapped ourselves in thick coats, scarves, and gloves in preparation for the long drive. We brought sandwiches, snacks, and a thermos of hot chocolate to keep us warm, and the anticipation of visiting relatives kept our spirits up. The first 100 miles went smoothly. We listened to the radio and chatted about all sorts of things, what I was learning in school, my mom's plans for the year, and how much Jack had grown lately. Outside the window, snow-covered fields and frost-covered trees flashed by, creating a peaceful winter landscape. There was something soothing about the quietness of the drive, the fact that despite the cold, the world outside the window seemed to be immersed in silence. The heater in the car kept us warm, and we felt safe inside our little bubble. I could see my mom smiling as she looked at Jack sleeping in his car seat, and it made me feel grateful for this small moment of peace in our otherwise chaotic lives. Eventually, we had to get onto the main highway, which took us out onto a forest road. The road was paved but potholed, and it was not an easy drive. Mom tried her best to avoid the bumps, but after an hour of driving on the bumpy road, the car broke down. There was a snowy forest all around us, no one in sight, and the temperature was dropping fast. My mom tried several times to start the car, but it just wouldn't budge. We were stuck in the middle of nowhere, and a piercing cold began to enter the car. I felt panic rising in me, but I tried to stay calm for Jack's sake. Mom took a deep breath and assured me that everything would be okay. After a while, a tractor drove by and stopped. A man in his 50s got out. He had a kind but weathered face, and his eyes seemed to carry years of hard work and experience. He wore an old sweater, simple pants, and heavy boots. A large black mustache gave him an old-fashioned look, but his smile was friendly. He introduced himself as George. He inspected our car and said it would need more work than we could do on the side of the road. George said he could tow us to his village and he would fix it in the morning. Mom reluctantly agreed as we really had no other choice. George hooked our car up to his tractor and towed us to his barn, which was on the outskirts of a small village that looked almost deserted in the winter cold. George then invited us into his house for tea to keep us warm. The house was small but cozy. A fire crackled in the fireplace, filling the room with warmth and light. The old wooden furniture gave it a rustic charm, and the smell of burning wood made it cozy. Mom fed Jack first and put him to bed in one of the far rooms of the house. George lived alone, and although he was not used to receiving guests, he was very hospitable and kind. He offered us blankets and warm tea, and I felt the warmth of the fire drive the cold out of my bones. The warmth of the room made me drowsy, and I felt myself relaxing despite the situation we were in. While we warmed ourselves with mugs of tea, George excused himself and went to heat the bath. He soon returned and continued chatting with my mom. They talked about raising children, life in the village, and their past experiences. As they talked, I noticed that my mother seemed to relax. Her usual wariness had softened, and she even laughed at some of George's jokes. She smiled at him more often, and there was a warmth between them that I hadn't noticed in Mom in a long time. I think she felt a connection, a realization that George knew what it was like to struggle but also find ways to be happy. I watched them from my seat, feeling a strange sense of comfort that Mom had let her guard down. An hour later, I decided to take a bath. George had heated the bathhouse for us. It was a simple wooden structure, but it was warm, and the steam felt wonderful after the cold. I could feel the tension of the journey slowly leaving my body as I soaked in the hot water. It was exactly what I needed. The steam was rising around me, and for a moment I felt completely relaxed, as if all my worries had melted away. Meanwhile, Mom and George stayed at the table and talked. I could faintly hear them through the walls, their voices soft and friendly. When I returned, I noticed they were still chatting and Mom was smiling at George. There was a growing connection between them, an unspoken understanding that seemed to transfer between their gazes. It was something I hadn't noticed in her in a long time, and it gave me hope. When it was my mom's turn to wash up, George stayed for a while before heading over there as well. I looked out the window and noticed that George hadn't come out of the bath for about 10 minutes. Feeling uneasy, I decided to check it out. As I walked over, I heard my mom's voice, "MMM. Yeah. You're doing great, but don't rush so much." I froze, realizing what was happening. I felt a mixture of emotions: surprise, confusion, and a strange sense of acceptance. I walked back into the house, realizing that it was Mom's choice, and they seemed to genuinely care for each other. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames and trying to make sense of what I had just heard. It wasn't what I expected, but if it made my mom happy, then maybe it wasn't so bad. The next morning, my mom told me we were staying because George turned out to be the good man she was looking for. She looked happier than I had seen her in years, and I couldn't deny that George treated her well. He was attentive to her and made her laugh, and there was a spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. George made breakfast for us, a simple but hearty breakfast. He made scrambled eggs, fried bacon, made toast, and we all sat down to eat together. The warmth of the house, the smell of breakfast, and Mom's smile made me feel at home in a way I hadn't felt in years. A month later, Mom joyfully announced that she was pregnant. George was immensely happy and began planning to expand the house to make room for the new baby. He even started building a new room, and I could see how much effort he was putting into it. He wanted our family to have everything we needed. Every day after he finished his chores, George worked on the new room. He was taking measurements, sawing wood, hammering nails, and as the walls of the new room began to take shape, I realized how much he cared about us. He wasn't just building a room, he was building a future for our family. A year later, she gave birth to a baby girl they named Grace, and our family felt complete. Grace's arrival brought so much joy into our lives. George became a wonderful father to her, and he loved Jack like family. Our days were filled with the laughter and cooing of a baby, and the house that had seemed so small before was now a warm, loving home. I could see how happy my mom was, and it made me happy too. I enrolled in a technical college and moved into a dormitory, which was a big change for me. I was excited to start a new chapter of my life to learn and grow, but some part of me missed the warmth of home. I called my mom often, and she would tell me about all the little things: Grace's first steps, Jack's adventures, and George's progress in building a house. I was genuinely happy for Mom, but I couldn't bear to listen to their love games almost every night. So I decided to stay in town as long as possible. I found a part-time job at a local diner, which helped me cover some of my expenses, and I spent most weekends at friends' houses instead of going back to the village. Despite the hardships, I knew my mom had finally found happiness, and it was worth it. Seeing her smile and watching her with Grace and Jack made me realize that sometimes life takes unexpected turns, but those turns can lead to something wonderful. I tried to visit as often as I could, and each time I returned, I saw how much Grace had grown and how happy Jack was. My visits home became less frequent, but each time I saw how much Jack and Grace had grown. Grace had George's eyes and my mom's smile, and Jack adored his little sister. The country seemed like another world compared to the city, with its slow pace and simple pleasures. George often took Jack with him to help with chores, and I could see Jack obeying him. He was the father Jack never had, and I was grateful to George for taking on that role. George taught Jack how to fish, how to fix things around the house, how to be patient and kind. I watched Jack grow into a responsible boy, and I knew it was because of George's influence. One summer, I decided to stay in the village for a week. It was nice to get away from the noise of the city, be surrounded by nature, and spend time with my family. George taught me how to chop wood, and we spent evenings sitting around the fire and talking about everything and nothing. Mom would cook hearty meals, and we would all sit together, enjoying each other's company. It was in these moments that I realized how much I had missed family togetherness. The love between my mom and George was evident in the way they looked at each other, in the small gestures of affection that passed between them. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. Jack and I would take Grace for walks in the countryside, showing her the birds and animals, and she would giggle and clap her hands. Everything was simple, but beautiful. Life took an unexpected turn, but it led us to a place of happiness and peace. My mom found someone who loved her, who treated her well, and I found a sense of stability I didn't even realize I needed. Looking at Grace playing in the yard, Jack helping George fix the fence, and my mom smiling at me from the kitchen window, I knew we were exactly where we needed to be. The future was uncertain, but I knew that as long as we had each other, everything would be okay. We found our home not only in the house we lived in, but in the love we shared as a family.